for today, we're supposed to be discussing narcissism and Kohut's theories in particular. I thought I would start just a little bit of background leading up to Kohut, because you read some of Winnicott and the notion of a self and the notion of a true and a false self. It just depends upon how you want to interpret what that means. What is a true self?
Oh, yeah, right.
What is a false self? So the binary is already been introduced in the terminology, but for simplistic sake, Winnicott was trying to, I think he was trying to get at a notion of this spontaneous sense of the self that's authentic, and that a true self can be a spontaneous, authentic, genuine expression of one's interiority and creativity and generativity, unencumbered by the constraints of the external world and the maternal environment in particular. However, I'm not sure that's actually the case in reality. Yet, the notions are clinically relevant in the sense that a lot of people, they really don't know who they are. They don't know who or what forces in themselves are true, false, authentic, inauthentic, and they've internalized their environment and their objects, internal objects. The notion of a false self is a little bit more clear, that there's some notion of an impediment that's been put on development, and that one develops certain defenses in such a way that it's trying to protect this self, protect this authentic core or center, but the defenses is what gets a person through. Maybe in a Jungian notion, the false self would be a persona, the public face we put on when we come outside, where people's defenses are such as they pretend, they fake, they feign, they go along with social expectations, but to such a degree that the false self really doesn't even know who it is. Now, of course, this all begs the question of what is a theory of the self. But it may have certain clinical utility that you might use as a heuristic device when you're theoretically trying to understand how a person presents themselves. Does this person present as someone who authentically feels their sense of agency? Or is this somebody who kind of presents in a way because they think that how they need to come across to others, to society, in order to be accepted, to be liked, to be loved? And it's only on the condition that they act a certain way that they'll be accepted. Some other aspects of Winnicott in the previous readings, briefly, of course, is the notion of a holding environment. So whether it be the maternal, way of trying to encapsulate a sense of presence with the infant from the mother, it could be the father. Of course, we talked about, attachment figures are interchangeable depending upon the context. However, these are the terms that were used in those days. And Winnicott talks about, a good enough mother. meaning that you only have to be good enough. I mean, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be ideal. You don't, let alone, to be, Jesus who's idealized. It's just what is the notion of adequacy, and that, if you have a fairly good enough caretaker, a love object that's present, that's responsive, that is available, that is important, versus the absent parent, so to speak, or the parent who is, more malevolent in some ways, who's negative in their presence. All these things, impact upon the sense of self and the development of the self. And Winnicott then also talked about the notion of transitional phenomenon. Now, this is all leading up to Kohut, by the way. So everybody knows about the transitional object, the proverbial teddy bear, or pacifier, or blanket. But the notion here is that it's an internal object that acts as a transitional buffer for an infant, but also for any of us, like the patient-analyst relationship, the child-parental relationship. Whether that is a good analogy, I can't say, but it's simply, there in the literature. To be quite honest, I don't view myself as a parent to my patients. But that doesn't mean they don't imbue me with certain transference properties and expectations. And so we have to accept the fact that we are going to be transitional phenomenon.
Excuse me. I thought the transitional object, as Winnicott talks about it, is different from transference. I mean, the whole point of calling it a transitional object is to say it will make do in spite of not having.
Yeah, but the notion, though, still everything's transferential.
Okay.
I mean, like we'd have to back up and talk about what is transference. So, of course, transference can be defined in so many different ways. The notion that we project onto others expectations or fantasies or thoughts that may not actually come from them, but we imbue them with certain unconscious fantasies. Whether we are aware of that or not is happening.
Yeah.
And so, at the same time, a transference projection can also act as a transitional or phenomenon.
Okay.
Because it helps bind a person's psyche to an object, an expectation, a future state of events, a wish fulfillment, things like this. And on one hand, this also introduces the notion that we can have, more or less, untainted or more accurate perceptions of others. And on the other hand, we can distort what we actually see or experience or hear. And that's very important, especially in our work with people, because all the time, you're going to hear this all the time, that you said something in your mind, you thought you said this, and they heard it this way. And then that's something that needs to be then, analyzed or discussed or opened up for a dialogue about. And then, of course, some patients are going to be much more open to that, and others are going to shut down. Others are going to be more attuned to these nuances. Others are going to just introduce bifurcations. So speaking about last week, we were talking about splitting. It's like, that didn't happen. No, you were this way. But you didn't experience it that way. So these are, I think, your question is really good because it shows how loose these terms, and not only the term, but what it signifies. It's signifying a psychological phenomenon or a function. So Winnicott, he was a precursor to Kohut in many ways, but everything's a precursor to every school that develops out of earlier schools. To be quite honest, I don't think there's anything really that new. It's just the emphasis. However, it's important because those emphases can matter in the way we kind of come to conceptualize things. So even though Winnicott talked about how there are these transmutational internal objects that affect the self, whether it be toward an authentic center or more of a inauthentic way of being, this is, in many ways prefigured by Freud's notion of primary narcissism, and basically this is a very debated and contested area because any infant observation researcher or anybody writing about the interior of an infant's mind is merely engaging in speculative metaphysics. and like, it doesn't matter who it is, even if you have wonderful video footage of the framework by framework pictures of infant observation with maternal responsiveness that's taking place. Let's say Beatrice Beebe and her work, or Daniel Stern before that, Boston Change Process Group, a number of these important people, the whole attachment literature. We can't know what's really transpiring within the psyche of an infant, but we could speculate. Certain basic processes must be operative. For Freud, there's a state of undifferentiation between the infant and the whole world. Really, there's this immersion in a sense of unity, undifferentiated symbiotic unity. And it's only when, the capacities for the sense of self come with differentiating between inner and outer, between self-referent and other-referent, that these kinds of divisions come into play. So here you have the basic foundation of thinking. Klein emphasizes the notion of splitting self and other, or self and object. But this has a very long history in philosophy. I mean, this is the very foundation of the mind, the very foundation of thinking itself, which is important. Which is important if anyone is interested in this kind of history. But from the standpoint of analytic work, how does that translate to the notion of what the topic we're supposed to talk about tonight? And that's narcissism. Well, again, this has a convoluted history encumbered by the term. And so the notion of the narcissist, of course, goes back to Greek mythology and the emphasis on self-love and self-absorption. Well, it was Kohut who really wanted to reinvigorate this discourse, and having been trained in Chicago, where Kohut was, and been supervised by many people who were trained by Kohut, it depends upon who you talk to. You can interpret his theories in many different ways. I find Kohut to be extremely important and very helpful because of the way he introduced the notion of the self, and yet we have to kind of prepare the ground here. So narcissism has a intrinsically bad flavor to it. The word is pejorative in today's nomenclature. It means you're a self-centered asshole. But from the standpoint of healthy development, one would expect that an individual would develop a healthy sense of self. Well, we can call that healthy narcissism, or we can use the more, politically favorable term of, healthy self-esteem. So a person who feels good about themselves, who has a certain internal sense of stability, structure, self-cohesion, things like this. We would, if one isn't internally narcissistic, meaning in a healthy sense, then that actually is seen as a pathology. So it depends upon how you want to relate to the term. So Kohut introduces a new centrality around the psyche, and he introduces the term self-object. Now keep in mind, Winnicott talked about a transitional object. In many ways, they serve a similar theoretical feature, and they certainly mean the same in terms of having a certain psychic function to the psyche. So whether it be transitional objects or the quotient of the self-object, is that these things tend to regulate the psyche or the self. And what is a self-object? In many ways, it's an aspect of another person, or a part of that person, or a quality, but it doesn't always have to be a person. It could be an inanimate object, it could be an abstraction, an idea, an ideal that's incorporated into the self, and it's experienced as part of the self. So when you use that definition, that means basically that everything could potentially be a self-object, because everything that we experience is incorporated into who we are, at least consciously in the moment, and we relate to it. But Kohut didn't mean it that way. because we obviously experience things in our perceptual consciousness. We take them in, we register them as just meaningless data. So objects that are actually imbued with value and made part of ourself have a certain, type of currency to that individual, and hence we want to grant that the notion of a self-object to be much more important to an individual, and it performs a regulatory function. And the regulatory function is basically that it maintains some sense of psychic cohesion or continuity of the self. It's not necessarily the object. It's the function that constitutes the self-object. So, for instance, it could be that a self-object experience is really about my relationship to something complex. It could be I have a relationship not only to a person, I have a relationship to my job, to food, to alcohol, to drugs, to obsessive behaviors, to artistic production, you name it. That it's whatever the experience where it's imbued as being central or integral to regulating the self is what we would say is self-object experiences.
If I could interrupt,
Yeah.
I have a sister who is 80 years old, and her sisters, we would like for her to move to be closer to us so that we can help take care of her as she ages. But she doesn't want to leave her house. And for a long time, we would be involved in arguing with her about the benefits of living closer to us. And then I went out to visit her a few weeks ago, and in the many conversations, she talked about her house as having bought her house was like a major achievement for her that had many layers of meaning to her, having to do with surviving a divorce and many, many different things. And I realized that what we felt as resistance to being helped by being close to family was related to this sense that there was a meaning to her living in a house that she had bought and paid for and was in her name and her name only. That was doing something for her that was hard to put into words. And I think as you're talking about what a self-object is, it seems to fit the way she was talking about her house.
Yeah, it'd be like her giving up herself.
Yeah.
It'd be like the law, not just a loss, it might be even experienced as a psychic death.
Yeah.
And hence why so many people don't, or seniors in particular, don't want to leave the familiar.
Right.
I mean, I'm just as guilty. I mean, I wouldn't want my psychic space to be disrupted, because that's what this is, really. This physical space, yes, but it's psychic space.
Right.
And that one has, come to feel grounded in. There's a psychology of place.
Yeah.
that is so important to people who feel grounded. And those who don't are like the wandering nomad.
But I mean, as you guys are talking, it just occurs to me how much this is shifting economically. That, like, I talk to so many students who are becoming teachers, and most of the time they'll have like this crisis of like, my dad wants me to be an accountant, but I would really love to be an art teacher. But I'm never going to get a house. And I'm like, yeah, I don't have a house either. My mom had a house, my dad has a house. It's great for them.
Yeah.
If you really want a house, then yes, become an accountant. But it's sort of this funny thing where I feel like that too will shift. Like, how many people can afford to own property? I mean, the millennials and their avocado toast and all that, right?
But that avocado toast becomes something that
It's an object.
It's an object. It's, I think, if you don't have things, big things like houses or an office or something,
You have to have.
you have other things that you can point to. I'm still who I was before that bad thing happened, because I'm still eating avocado toast, so I must still be the same person.
That's a good point. Yeah, different objects. Maybe it's not a house anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we on target?
Yeah, but I would want to say though, Courtney, that the person who still has a relationship to the ideal of being an artist or being an art teacher, and what that fulfills and what the function that means to them is that they don't have to have this house. That it's other things, the values, the ideals that they aspire to become, that what they identify with. That is what serves self-object functions that regulates the self. So, I mean, if that wasn't the case, I mean, look at all the people in the world who, use whether you call it transitional objects or phenomenon, or whether you call it self-object experience. I mean, religion is a perfect example. One's religion is what is a self-object experience. One could also say that religion is related to an ideal or ultimate attachment figure. They serve regulatory functions of the psyche that produce a sense of cohesion. If we were to use the attachment phraseology, we'd call it a secure base, or a secure sense of self, or sense of safety, or to use Erickson's notion of trust versus mistrust. I mean, all of these things could be compared, and we would probably in the end say they're getting at the same thing or similar things. We just have different nuances to these theories.
But each one also has its own nuance.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely.
There is a lot of overlap, but there's a little bit on the edge that's not overlap.
This is what's so exciting about psychoanalytic theory, but about anything. I mean, it's all in the details.
Right.
And these nuances make a difference to a person, and they make a difference. I mean, meaningfully, it makes a difference meaningfully to someone how they experience something. The whole notion of the choice of a word, even though semiotically we can't even trace its origin, even though it might leave a trace or might leave a mark. We don't know where it comes from. The word is interpreted and experienced and internalized differently for each person. So there's no fixed meaning to a word, such as a dictionary says this is what it means. No, it's what someone internalizes and attaches emotional meaning to something, an image, a symbolism, you might say, well, that doesn't really symbolize what, the study of this really is about. But it does to that individual. And the irreducibility of subjectivity is so important here. In many ways, our job is not to be the objectivity police. It's more like attunement to the subjective interior of our patients and what things mean to them. Now, of course, we can introduce the reality principle at any time, which sometimes is important to do when someone's completely distorted their experience of the subjective, such as when a patient of mine was, there's this notion, this contemporary notion in particularly relational psychoanalysis that was introduced by Stephen Mitchell, that there's no pristine epistemology, there is no God's eye view of the universe, if to use Bob Stollero's terms, that there's the irreducible notion of subjectivity with Owen Rennick. Yes, that's true. Absolutely. Our individual experiences are everything. They're paramount. However, it doesn't mean there's no such thing as objectivity. So when my patient says, I've been so persecuted by my insurance company who won't pay for my disability claim, that I can't make my bills, that I'm in horrible suffering, that I've decided that I was going to stalk them out. And I went to their building and I saw that at 10:30 in the morning, most people come out for a smoke break. And I realized that was the best time to drive my tractor trailer rig right into the building. I'd kill the most amount of people at that time. And when I introduce the notion of reality, I say, you're going to be arrested. There's nothing that if you do here is going to ever change the fact that you're suffering, other than the fact that you're going to bring more suffering on yourself. And hence that opened up a space for us to process his pain, rather than acting out on his rage and his murderous fantasies. Of course, this contained things, and he didn't do that. But sometimes patients need to know that we know what we're doing, that we know that there are certain objective aspects to reality. And if we collude with a purely, phantasmal, subjective view of the world, just because you want to placate them, it doesn't really help. However, like anything in life, how do we connect with somebody in such a way? How do we join with them? How do we validate them? How do we show empathy? How do we recognize without, devaluing their sense of self? Well, this is, in many ways, goes back to our subject tonight. How do we deal with certain aspects of the self that, let's say, are split off, that aren't integrated, and that are quite inflated or narcissistically grandiose, or manic, or entitled, versus the opposite of that, the opposite of the self that feels, depleted or besieged or worthless. This is why Kohut kind of introduces a model of the self that's on a continuum.
Did you say a model?
A model of the self that's on a continuum.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We lost you for a second.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So if you look at the self on a continuum, even though of course we don't experience ourselves in linear terms, but nevertheless, it might be useful to think of narcissism in a different way. So instead of let's say on one pole of the continuum, you have your traditional narcissist. So who is that type of person? We all know these people. Let's hope that let me preface this by saying that anyone who has healthy self-esteem is going to be narcissistically disposed. So by definition, I fit that bill. Now, would I be considered a narcissist, meaning in a pathological sense, well, I'm sure that's up to other people's opinion. However, it really comes down to whether or not a person is functional. The notion of a personality disorder by definition is that you have an incredible sense of rigidity, inflexibility, and recurrent patterns of disruption that usually affect all aspects of one's life. But a person who has a healthy sense of self usually is a person who's more sophisticated or cultivated and is going to be able to maintain boundaries between self and other, and incorporate other, and not only incorporate other, but need the other in order to enhance a sense of self. And so there's a mutuality and an interdependency between a healthy self and our relatedness to others. But the more rigid person might appear in stereotypical ways. On the one side, the one notion of the extreme narcissist is the person who's just horribly grandiose. They think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. Not only that, their sense of self is so inflated, so expansive, that they expect others to see them that way. That there's such a need for idealization that their very orientation to the world is about, cultivating self-objects to mirror how wonderful they are. And that's a term that Kohut introduces, and I like that notion. It's useful clinically. The notion of a self-object is a mirror. Just a couple people come to mind. How does a narcissist think? So the narcissist thinks in ways as, how do I incorporate objects so I'm the center of attention? So where, like, you go to a party, you meet people for the first time, strangers. You'll spot the narcissist in the crowd in a minute. These are the people who they wouldn't even think to ask you about yourself. They're talking about themselves the whole time. They are there staging a show. They're on drama. They're performing a skit. They want this constant mirroring They want to be validated, acknowledged, idealized as being wonderful, funny, admirable, whatever it may be, to the degree that people become a sea of objects. Not people, not subjects. You'll never hear, the word I mentioned so many times in a sentence. It's like a machine gun just spitting out, things. So this type of person is often also histrionic. That they not only require, but they need to have an audience. This inflated sense of self is on that one pole, and because of that, they don't really show any sentimentalization toward other people, other people's needs. They don't show empathy. Like they're not really thinking about the other, because when you're not thinking about another's feelings or thoughts or interests, you're simply not treating them as a human being. So you're not going to have empathy. Yet this is the very thing why this made somebody so narcissistic. They themselves act in ways that they have been deprived of. If they would have only received some attention, some validation, some confirmation, some recognition, of course, from early love objects, attachment figures in particular. It could be other people in the family system or extended communities that they might belong to. They've been deprived of that. That's why they're so damn hungry for it. And often the narcissist gets in there, and what they're running from, they're fleeing from, like a manic defense, a Kleinian manic defense, is not having to deal with that true aspect of themselves, that flawed aspect that they're dissociating from, distancing from, denying, repressing, and that is that deep down they feel like that they're a piece of shit. And here is the other pole of the narcissist, of the self continuum. The other pole is that depleted pole, that depressed pole, that vacuousness, internal emptiness that they don't want to have to feel. And hence the grandiosity, the mania is it's a compensatory defense against not having to accept feelings of inadequacy and shame.
Isn't it possible also, this is a question, I'm sort of floating a hypothesis, that some narcissism that you see in an adult comes from not having been tended to, but that there was maybe a sense of a false self-object where they didn't get realistic feedback from others. So they might have been told, for instance, that they were pretty, but they look in the mirror and think they're ugly. So they don't believe the feedback they get. Or somebody says something, oh, you're the best. And then they go to school and they realize they're not the best. There are other people that are better. So that even though they've been getting positive messages and they're not accurate enough to fulfill the role to feed the self, because the care or the feedback is not accurate enough to trust it.
You couldn't have said it more beautifully.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, isn't this the case? Geez, we see, like on one hand, and this is the dilemma of parents
Right.
in their
Right.
in their own relationship with their children. I mean, so on one hand, you don't want to say anything that narcissistically injures your child to lower their self-esteem.
Right.
You don't want to be the bad parent who says anything that they internalize as an insult or a a rejection of their core self.
Right.
And so, how does a parent deal with that? On the other hand, they haven't been presented with the truth, and that parents want to shelter kids from reality, and they present an illusion or a fantasy that confuses the kid. For any of us who have children, I believe we all do. What do we find ourselves in the middle of? When children are younger, they're one thing. When they're teenagers, they're another. And I feel like you're walking more on a tightrope around elements when kids get older. But for instance, I mean, so many things come to mind, Miriam, from what you just said. Let's say you have parents. A child had a deformity at birth. There was some kind of mole or growth or something on their face, and they couldn't take it off because the doctors were afraid that if they took it off at a small age, it would lead to scarification and a drooping of, I think, of the mouth.
Oh yeah.
So instead of acknowledging that it existed, they ignored it, and then when the child finally said, "What is this?" They called it, I think at the time, a strawberry or whatever, and they said, "You're special because you have it." And of course, the kid gets made fun of at school and things like that. And the identity is around having this thing. And when it could have been removed, he didn't want to have it removed. And then he grows up to be an adolescent, of course, and he's saying, "What the fuck are you doing? You should have had the doctor take that damn thing off immediately. Now I'm traumatized by this." So they think they're doing the right thing. And by not only that, by making it like you're special, made it seem like it's even more of a reason not to give it up. You don't want to say anything negative to your child because you don't want them to not like you. How do you say things that are critical that don't come across as a blanket negation of who they are? These are the things the dilemmas that we encounter. But a false sense of, grandiosity can develop, or also the notion of inferiority when it doesn't really warrant that justification. So, for instance, when parents are overly critical, overly judgmental about something that is not a big deal, it's neutral, but we take it as such a horrible thing, that's a scarification on the psyche.
Yeah.
So what you just said was, I think, very apt, because there's countless examples of how we're negotiating these things. We negotiate them now as adults all the time. Getting criticism from colleagues. I mean, it depends how we are disposed toward this. Some people are very intolerant of criticism. intolerant of any negative feedback. Others are like, well, let me sit back and absorb it, and let me see if that's true, and let me try to, if it is true, let me see if I can incorporate it and alter things to better myself. Perfect example is if any of you, you're all professors, so if you do any kind of scholarly writing for journals, I mean, when you get that, that rejection letter, oh my God, bastard, I get them all the time, right? They want modifications made, or they just simply say it sucks. You say, well, do I want to put my ego aside, deal with the criticism, deal with the hurt, and then say, do they have something of value to add to it? I'm going to then see if I can incorporate this into it, make it a better piece, resubmit, or do I say, these people are biased, they don't know what they're doing, they're just insecure.
Or they do what you just described. Like, there's a joke about reviewer 2. Reviewer 1 will sort of overinflate you and maybe make you narcissistic. Like, they'll say, oh, this was so great, this is so interesting, yay, go to your cheerleader. And then reviewer 2 is always like, this is useless. Like, your topic is useless, your methodology is useless. I don't know you, but I suspect you are useless. And either way, you're both leading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, well, wait till you get reviewer 3. So,
A lot of smaller education journals will only have 1 or 2 reviewers, but I submitted to a bigger one, and I feel like they were talking to each other, actually. It was like reviewer 1, reviewer 2, reviewer 3. It started to feel like a defense, like a dissertation defense, where it was like, oh, you put it here, put it back the way it was before. He says here, I say there. Do it this way, do it that way. Do it back the first way. It's fine.
well, yeah, I've been around a while, and there's politics to publishing. And let me give you
I
some...
think they know who it is. Like, if you're writing on a topic that's not really obvious, they probably have a sense that you're a woman. They probably have a sense that they have a sense you're a person of color, right? There's not really women.
So that's interesting that you immediately assume that the blind reviewer knows you as a woman or a person of color.
Well, sometimes I assume they might know me and like me and give me passes and deserve too.
Oh, I see.
But that's the point I was making, that you can be narcissistically wounded just by
Either way. Yeah, there can be a pass I don't deserve, or
feel accurate.
right. Yeah, you can make yourself feel bad about it regardless.
Yeah, or make yourself feel
Grandiose. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, if you feel that a reviewer is biased, and this has worked for me, you simply write back to the editor and you say, you think this person is biased for these reasons.
I've heard that. I wonder, did it work?
Oh, several times.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Not only that, I mean, if the reviewer doesn't know what they're talking about, you simply have to refute them and simply say they don't know anything about the field, and they don't know about this topic for this reason, and because of that, and they're biased. And anybody who takes such strong negative language like that, like that this is worthless, that this is stupid, this shouldn't be published, that person should be removed. And you tell the editor that because of the way they have presented themselves in the review, tells me immediately they're biased, and they're not being impartial or objective, and this should not even count. And not only that, if you say you should send this out to another reviewer who's going to be more impartial, and that this is what a conscientious editor should do. When you, as the submitting person, do that, the conscientious editor would look at that with, with some respect, as long as you don't use negative language, like the same language that the reviewer used. But this is why these things are a game. But getting back to how this still happens, the notion of this is the narcissism of minor differences in academia that keep people from getting published, because some person wants to suppress your thought because they don't like what you're saying. Usually it goes against their point of view or the position they want to promulgate. So this is how listen, in psychoanalysis, there is nothing in the literature. Those of us who publish think highly of ourselves. So there's a large degree of narcissism that's already present. And so the infighting is incredible. The infighting is, something just to be accepted. Now, I think it's interesting to be challenged. I like to be challenged. I like to have dialogue. I don't necessarily like to be criticized, but who cares? That's part of the pun and fun. And helps you develop yourself. You should be open to that. Those who say, you criticize me, I don't want to have a dialogue with you, you're the enemy. This is a good, example of how, bifurcations of self and other operate. The splitting operates. Happens in the field. If you look at, the comparative psychoanalytic literature, it's interesting how various schools of psychoanalysis will devalue the other school. They will put down the other school because they think that they have the touchstone of truth, or they're better or superior. It's a narcissistic position right in itself. And of course, some positions are, more persuasive than others. But some use straw man arguments to elevate themselves. They devalue the other without really necessarily reading them carefully. My joke is that, Freudians, that many of them, many of them lack a certain drive. They're interested in drive theory, but they lack a sense of, like nerve. They'll sit back and insulate themselves into the old club and then want to put down anything that's developed since then. You have the ego psychologists who seem to lack defenses. They just blurt things out or whatever. You have the object relations people who have trouble connecting with others. You have the self-psychologists who are horribly narcissistic. And then now you have the intersubjective relational people who don't know how to relate to people other than their own kind in a narcissistic way. And then you have the Lacanians. Oh my God. I don't even know where to start there. You have the Jungians. They have an inferiority complex because they're constantly having to defend themselves against Freud and everybody else. But having said that and being jokey about it, we seem to be drawn to certain theories that resonate within us, and it might be that there's an inferior function within us too that we resonate with, or that we're identified with, and that we would like to compensate for. So we like this approach or this theory over others. The more that you are familiar with your interior, you'll likely gravitate toward theories that resonate with you, hopefully in more authentic ways. and those are the approaches that probably you're more likely to adopt and feel more of an authenticity with and in simpatico with. Even though I'm a Freud scholar, I would never say that I practice like a Freudian in the consulting room. I'm not sitting there like an interpretation machine, just spewing out things. I don't find that useful. I don't find patients find that useful. And in the old days, this is what people were told: you need to do this, you have to do this. When I was supervised by a Kohutian at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, I'm not going to tell you who it is, but I felt like he treated me like a Freud, like an object, like a Freudian object, and it was weird. Despite being Kohutian, and you would think he would be tuned into, my needs as a supervisee. But rather than that, I felt like he was devaluing me all the time, putting me down all the time. And I didn't think that was very helpful as someone who was up and coming and training and not even, graduated, to the point where I didn't feel myself was being nurtured. So I learned a lot about how not to act with supervisees in particular, but also I don't want to be treated that way, so I'm not going to treat my patients that way. I notice I'm rambling on. Let me break again to see if there might be some other thoughts.
I thought it was interesting, like the connections made between narcissism and art, and I guess echoing some of the extremes you just mentioned, that like at one point, as like, I don't even like saying as an artist. Like people say, "Oh, you're an artist," and like on good days maybe, but that you might be tempted to like inflate the work and relate to it as like a landscape in a very like undifferentiated way, and then at other times completely devalue the work, like it's worthless, I'm worthless, everything's the worst. That made a lot of sense, but it was interesting. I think so. Yeah, I thought that example was interesting. I had a question, I'm trying to find it because I had annotated a different copy. I thought it was really intriguing and just like a good example, because usually we just get all this cerebral without an example. Yeah, there were like
Well, she's looking for that. I had a very theoretical question that when he's talking about sort of the origin of narcissism and all this, and he's talking about the ego and the superego, there's no talk at all of the id, which you would think would be the origin of narcissism. So, is there a reason for that? Just totally ignoring the id? I mean, did that drop out of
what you're saying is a good observation, that there's a shift toward more of a consciousness-centered experience.
Okay.
But keep in mind that whatever we experience consciously is always going to be deposited unconsciously. And so I believe maybe it's only in that article on Kohut. Kohut had to navigate a lot of obstacles in his career. So he first started with drive theory and had to modify it. So he does talk about libido and the instincts. I mean, even though that's the English translation, erroneous translation of Treba. And this he had to combat a lot of entrenched views that were taking place at the time. He and Leo Rangel had conflict, and Kohut and Rangel were colleagues, and yet at the same time very influential political figures in the International Psychological Association. Kohut was the president at one point. But Kohut introduces a new shift. He's talking about the centrality of empathy, which of course he stole from Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole notion comes from a humanistic tradition. Kohut's wife was a social worker who worked with Rogers at the University of Chicago.
Oh, wow.
I mean, complete plagiarism.
Mm-hmm.
But, he saw some value there. We all see value there. Of course, when you are attuned to another person, this notion of an emotional, empathic attunement to the other, very important part of any kind of psychotherapeutic technique. He introduces this in psychoanalysis proper. It's not about interpretation of what's right and wrong about what's the unconscious conflicts. No, it's about the empathic presence of the therapist with that person sitting in the chair or laying on the couch. And the transformational properties of empathy that are internalized and are interiorized within the self-structure is much more important than the notion of the drives, the urges that are teaming up and wanting to come out.
Right.
But keep in mind, we don't need to bifurcate them. So you have the psyche, the self, the human being, universally, we all have desires. So that's what Freud says. Our desires are part of our embodiment and part of who we are. That's what we bring to the scene. And these desires are sexual and aggressive in nature, to be very simplistic. And that we then develop certain defenses around them because they create conflicts, because they're in opposition to one another. And then we develop into much more sophisticated beings. So the parents who are attuned to their children, who provide nurturance and love, and they listen. The notion of empathy is that you feel understood. You feel felt. When you feel felt, like someone feels me, you start to tear up in your eye because they're in pain. It happens all the time. You're really attuned to their interior, and there's a mirroring that's taking place because you feel for them. That's when you feel that, okay, I'm the patient. I feel my therapist feels me. They see me. They're holding me in the moment when when I'm touched, or when I'm in touch with my suffering. And you have that moment, of reciprocal, recognition is a beautiful moment. And it's a beautiful transformational moment in the therapy. That, in many ways, comes from the object relations and self-psychological community. Now it's been absorbed and annexed and subsumed in what we call relational psychoanalysis today. Kohut, in my estimation, did a lot by introducing humanistic concepts in a very direct way. So, for instance, like, you're not really going to get moved when you go to see your therapist and they have that brilliant interpretation, and you're just left, oh, wow, now I understand who I am, you know, and you walk away feeling enlightened. No, it didn't happen for me. Maybe it happened for others, but I would say it's probably an idealized transference that's not really based in reality anyway. I needed to have my dad, you know, be the fount of wisdom and the sage to help me through this maze here. But the person who's, you know, attuned on a micro level, on the microdynamics of what is, you know, unfolding in the process, in the moment, and you are there, you're present, you demonstrate that, you've done a great deal for your patient. Maybe for the first time they feel listened to, they feel understood, they feel felt. And you might not even have to say anything other than be there. There's a sense of validation with that. There's a sense of acknowledgement of the self. And I think this is what Kohut was really wanting to convey. So even though it might seem like conscious phenomenon, these things are metabolized unconsciously and in treatment over time, certainly. You know, what will be interesting is that the 3 or the 4 of you are in your own treatment, how you'll look back at that many years to come. How will you view your analyst or therapist? And if you walk away saying I had a wonderful experience, and you have this idealized view, you probably didn't have a realistic integration of what it's really about. I mean, I went through 3 different treatments, and I kind of view them all as real people. Some were better at certain things than others. I appreciate them all. Some were very difficult. One was in particular was quite difficult. He was trained by Bion. Another one was a self-psychologist and very lovely man. But I felt like we really didn't get into any depth. And then my third was a senior who actually was trained by Winnicott and by Anna Freud. And I felt, I would not say that he was Winnicottian. He felt more classical, but I internalized him in a Winnicottian way. But again, this is just my own subjective reflections of metabolizing someone, just like you metabolize your parents. And so you take the good and the bad, and please forgive them when they make mistakes. We all do. When you've made a mistake and you know it, and you're able to say, listen, I feel like I really kind of screwed up there, so sorry. That can go a long way to reparation than the person who has to pretend that they are the one who always knows. So when Winnicott talks about the restoration of the self, or the disruptive restoration process, this is what human experience is really all about. Our sense of self is constantly disrupted, Every day it's disrupted. What are you talking about? You go home and you have to deal with your family, or you have to deal with irritants at work, or this stress or that stress. How do you restore yourself? Some people are sent off into rages. Others they fall into a sense of, quiet depletion. They feel, horribly besieged, and they don't have any energy to deal with things. The more you apply these psychoanalytic concepts toward your own life, you'll see it everywhere. The notion of the self-object functions, mirroring, is one thing. Again, needing to be acknowledged, attuned to, understood, validated. But there's also the other notion of idealization, that we need to have a set of values that we look up to. We need other people, we need abstractions, we need values, mores. We need our society to function in ways that fulfill self-object needs. This is all part of, I think, Kohut's contribution. Okay, I'll do a brief pause again. Did you find yours, Courtney?
Oh, I was reading through it again and again, and I thought it was interesting. I was trying to see, it was like narcissism in terms of both like the audience or public, and then also, and this is a metaphor that I found interesting, that they were comparing the artwork to a child, because when I did my dissertation like a billion years ago, a lot of the educators, particularly in ceramics, like MFA professors and teachers alike, would say making pottery like making babies. Like men would often say this, and I
making what?
Funny, so I said it to all those. I interviewed like 30 women, and all of them were like, "It is absolutely not. That metaphor is totally wrong. My pots are not my babies." And I found it really interesting. So I'm sort of wondering, is that like a metaphor? It doesn't fit. I'm just rambling. So I found all of that really
I was thinking of Lowell. I don't know if that's his name, how to pronounce his name, but that he said you regress to pull the id into your personality to maintain a childlike view.
Oh yeah,
the joy of life.
Right. That's a good point.
So in that sense, I think art is
childlike. Got it.
Well, I think those who lose the childlikeness in adulthood have lost a certain numinosity to life. They've lost a zest to life.
Right.
And that's why.
Do you think he's trying? I got lost in this part about art.
It was so different. It was so different than the rest of the article. I'm like, wow, now we're on auditing this. Here we go.
Yeah. I forgot where I was going. A lot of what he said about art I can relate to, but I thought this, where he's talking about the oceanic feeling, that's a Freud, right?
Oh, that's Freud out of Civilization and its Discontents.
Oh yeah. But he talks about that being the source of art. Did you?
Shall we?
There's right here.
Oh yeah. The original psychological universe, the primordial experience of the mother, is one of the teaching part of the the current being reparations known as the oceanic feeling. Yeah. And this is one of those things where I feel like this can be really gendered, because all these kinds of things, like It seems like something that may or may not resonate.
So
Well, I thought,
Like moonlight or not.
well, I thought, because you're saying that civilization, that's about the origin of religious feelings, right?
this is what Freud's view is.
Yeah. Yeah. So here he's saying that, the genuine, well, in contrast to the oceanic feeling, however, which is experienced passively and fleetingly, the genuine shift of the cathexis toward a cosmic narcissism is the enduring creative result of the steadfast activities of an autonomous ego, and very few people can reach that. Number one, it's a very long, complex
Yeah, I'd have to dissect it line by line, but I think from what you just simply said, that so this is a good example of why the unconscious is already presupposed in his writing.
Oh, yeah.
That, you know, an infant, for Freud, and he's talking about this in the first chapter of Civilization and Its Discontents. And this was written 3 years after The Future of an Illusion.
Oh, yeah, right.
Where Freud, completely dismantles religion as a delusion. And in this paper, he's talking about his friend, Romain Rolland, who's a theologian and pen pal, and that his friend writes to him and says that even, you don't understand the true sentiment of religious experience. And it has nothing to do really with, what belief in in religious doctrine. It has to do with this feeling of this unbounded, experience and unity with the world, with the universe. And we'll see this in all kinds of doctrines. I mean, religious doctrines, particularly in the East, with Vedic philosophy, with Neoplatonism, with Buddhism, Hindu, variations of Hindu philosophy as well. But he's talking about it as a Christian to Freud, who's Jewish. And he says, you haven't caught it. The real issue is that this feeling that this oceanic experience is really what it's about. Freud wants to boil that down to some kind of symbiosis of the infant with the mother. Hence a primary narcissism. Well, that doesn't really seem to capture what other people talk about when they feel some sense of, even now in physics, right? There's a sense of unity, oneness, singularity with the cosmos that people are writing about. Whatever floats your boat. But Kohut here, I think, is trying to detach the autonomous ego from the symbiotic union.
Oh.
And when that autonomous ego detaches, hence you have a narcissistic, grandiose self.
Oh, yeah.
I'm the center of my own universe here. And of course he makes leaps and bounds when it comes to, not only does he talk about art, but morality, but wisdom, a number of things that he goes on a tangent on. Which you may or may not agree with. And keep in mind, people who publish in psychoanalytic periodicals are not philosophers.
Right.
So, I mean, this might not have even passed a blind review, let alone the third reviewer. of a philosophy journal.
Yeah.
But again, try to take what you can from something, what makes sense to you and what doesn't. But the narcissist is the person who believes they're the center of the universe. They've become God. And that grandiosity is incredible when it comes crashing down. Often that's why narcissists commit suicide. They're very prone to it. I've had more narcissistic men kill themselves than I've had, not that I'm seeing personally, but people who I've supervised, because of the tenuousness of their sense of self, the fragility of it.
Right.
And when they lose the grandiosity or everything that they built their life around, it could be everything from their business to getting divorced to, dealing with a narcissistic injury that they did not anticipate or could, abate. They don't see other ways out. Hence the depletion comes in, the sense of worthlessness, and these are the things that we, try to stave off. And if you're too one-sided, if you view yourself in such a one-sided manner, like a thing, you're bound to have your bubble busted. I mean, this is why, when Freud introduces the notion of the dual aspect monism, is what it's called in philosophy, but the dual dimensions of desire, that's libidinal and aggressive, Jung talks about as the tension of opposites. And these tensions in opposites in our mind need to have a dialogue with one another. They need to be neutralized. They need to be reintegrated into a new feature of the psyche. There's no way that we can just deny they exist, because when you deny them, repress them, dissociate them, they come back. This is what we call compromise formation. They just materialize as a symptom, just like they would materialize as a dream, or as visions, or as a slip. A slip is about as innocuous as you can get. In fact, I said one the other night, having unfortunately too many glasses of wine. And revealing someone's secret publicly, which I regret. But nevertheless, my mind at the time couldn't contain that, and it came out. And then I have to try to shore these conflicts up. I'm sure you can all relate.
Yeah.
Well, I'm mindful that our time has gone over. Any last questions before we end up?
Well, I have to run to text my land.
Okay. Well, nice to see everybody. See you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.